Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Fisher. I am the founder and chief executive and transformation officer for Global Equity Forward, and we are an international equity and inclusion consulting company. And today, in celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday, I and my friend wanted to have a conversation. So I will introduce my friend who's joined me today.
Hi, my name is Zara Espinoza, and I am a people and culture professional, as some people would also know that as HR or human resources, particularly in the tech industry and nonprofits. I like also identifying as a Jedi strategist, with Jedi not just being from my Star Wars fandom, but also standing for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Since a lot of my work, it's embedded in that, even just down from employee relations, payroll benefits, anything that affects a human. Should have a Jedi stamp and strategy behind it. So yeah, nice to meet everyone who's tuning in, and I'm just very honored to be here with you, Maya.
Well, Zara and I have a connection. We both spent some time in Japan, and we connected through that. But then we found alignment and a lot of similarities in our equity and inclusion work. Mm-hmm. And so we were talking a few days ago and thought, we started talking about Martin Luther King and, the approaching holiday. And we were wondering, what does Martin Luther King Jr. mean today in 2021? He's the civil rights sort of patriarch, if you will. I don't know. He's the leader of our parents' generation, the civil rights movement. And so we've grown up learning about him. But, what does he mean? What is his legacy? And so we just thought we would, do a short conversation and talk a little bit about that and share it with the world. And that would be our contribution in honor of him today.
Yeah.
So, Zara, does that sound like what we agreed on?
No, it totally is. And it's also one of those things where, like, especially in today's age of the internet and everything being so immediate, there's already so much fabulous content being put out there by fellow diversity, equity, inclusion, or people professionals like us. And so I hope that the listeners, our viewers, get to enjoy and really invest time in them too. But I really am looking forward to having this be a resource and a conversation that helps support or continue or start conversations beyond Martin Luther King's birthday.
Yeah. So actually earlier today, you were talking about the letter from Birmingham jail, and that every year you try to read it, and that every year it says something different to you. So why did you, so what motivated you to start reading it, and sort of, what does it say to you in 2021?
So one of the reasons I first started reading it was that like you said, Maya, we grew up learning about Martin Luther King, at least I did. And for context, everyone, I originally grew up in Michigan, so way west Michigan. As most Michiganders will know, it's right here. And everyone not from Michigan will make fun of me for using my hand as geography. But so I grew up in a really small town in Michigan. I'm adopted. I'm a multiracial adoptee, as in I'm multiracial biologically, and I was raised in a Mexican-American household. So even through my adoption, I'm multiracial. So I really always enjoyed learning about Martin Luther King, because he was one of the few people of color that was a leader that was celebrated in history class. And something that really, we always hear, I have a dream, right? But I noticed as I got older and more invested in this Jedi or DEI, most people call it diversity, equity, inclusion work, and people work, particularly when it comes to Black rights and civil rights in our American history. I really love the quote, like, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But that wasn't from I have a dream.
I have a dream. Yeah.
It was from the letter to Birmingham jail. And so I was a little scared to read it. I honestly, though I'm a multiracial and not white identifying person, I was scared to read it because I was afraid what I've known of Martin Luther King would change. And it did. It did. When I first read it, I found it very overwhelming. And I've now read it for the past 4 or 5 years. So now being in my 5th year reading it, I found it reading it this year, it was really hard to stay focused on it. Not because his words didn't matter, but it's because I am just overwhelmed because this is the same. If this was written in 1963 or the early 1960s, the letter from Birmingham jail, it feels like it was written yesterday.
Exactly. I have the same response to that.
And I'm frustrated. I'm angry. I'm overwhelmed. I'm tired. And as I'm not surprised, but it was overwhelming, that feeling. And so that's why it's been harder to read it this year, but I'm pushing through. And that's one of the reasons why that resonates with me. But continue, Maya, with what you were saying about like, it feels like it was written yesterday.
Oh my gosh. So there's a passage in the letter that I had a sort of a small piece of it that resonated with me. And then when I went back and actually read the full text, was like, oh my gosh, this could have been written yesterday. And so the shorter passage is this passage about shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting because it's in this context of the letter where he's talking about, the progress for Negroes in 1963. The progress isn't from sort of the extremes. It's not from the Klan. It's not from these, very clear white supremacist groups, but it's from moderate white people, right? Who are constantly asking to keep the peace, right? Not to disturb things. And he is quoted as writing, who prefers, they're more devoted to order than to justice. They prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, right? And so what I've been hearing recently from our public officials is this idea of healing. And, now is not the time. If we do something now, it's going to cause greater disturbance and disarray. And, to me, that's what resonated with like, oh my gosh, he was talking about this 70, 60 years ago, and he could have been talking about this now. And what resonated with me was, now I understand why people in these movements, in these justice movements, feel so frustrated, feel like they are constantly fighting battles uphill because, we all exalt Martin Luther King for what he said and what he did, what he stood for, and what he helped to achieve. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is great and it's important, but the struggles that he was arguing about are the same struggles we're having right now. And if in 60, 70 years we haven't really been able to figure it out, or we've been trying to do things more smoothly, then radically, then I can definitely understand the frustration, which is why when people look to me, I don't know if you get this, Zara, but when people are asking, are you sure you want to do this? Because, people are going to say they want to do X, but then end up doing Y. And, you don't in the end really make a change or a difference. And I recognize that frustration and that reality, but he also argues that doesn't make us stop trying, doesn't make us stop fighting. But I do think acknowledging the length of this particular fight is important if we're going to move forward.
Absolutely. And it's multidimensional, right? So
right.
I love how you said that it's just kind of, from what I could get listening to you, like this kind of like the idea of the moderate, and it tends to be majority white. But I also want to call out that the idea of white moderacy, or just moderacy in general, is not just white, and white is limited to race only. That Martin Luther King wasn't just fighting for, yes, against racism and civil rights, but civil rights and human rights encompass so much more than just those things. And with that too, it's just, I kind of feel it's just kind of like, it's like music, right? Like for me, like the I Have a Dream speech is like the music I want to listen to before I'm about to go work out, or I'm about to go like run a marathon.
Your pump up jam,
Yeah,
right?
pump up,
Yeah.
right? It has this neutrality about it. Even just how he delivers the speech in the rhythm, like the I have a dream and how he talked. And I think that also gives back to he was a Baptist minister. So it was like he is taking me to church with that. But the letter to Birmingham jail, because we don't hear him talk it and we don't get to hear that, it's left to so many more nuances along with other publications that he has written too, that are lesser known, where that's, I think, where it makes it so uncomfortable, because when you yourself know truths, like for me, I know that that racism ain't new, that white supremacy didn't just come out of nowhere, and that inequality and inequities aren't just a problem of the 2020s and since COVID and everything else. These are age-old, century-long problems, even before slavery, all the way back to, Native American, and, there's the gamut could go on. And so it's just like, I think what has made it hard sometimes to grapple, not just with, the letter of Birmingham jail, reading that, is thinking of like, how much more was censored, how much more of our education, because you and I have a root of education in you being a doctor, PhD, but also us being part of like, starting in like, the international education system in our lives, what other parts have been changed and censored to push a certain narrative, and how much of this have been, for convenience of like, okay, when I was younger, like the I have a dream thing is something I needed, especially as a multiracial queer woman in a small town who felt really alone. Like that kind of like, I have a dream pushed me to greater things because it got me hype, right? Like I was saying, and reading the letter from Birmingham jail and other publications of Dr. King and what ultimately he was fighting for, and is still happening today, where like, that's where I'm getting at, where it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier about that like selective speech and that willingness to like let something go wrong, like you were saying, with like moderacy. Like I'm willing to, I don't want tension, like I'm being afraid of the conflict, and ultimately with good intentions ultimately having bad outcomes.
Right. And I mean, the idea, so I know some people who might have known me in high school. I loved drama. Like I sought drama. And so when you're talking about conflict, in my older age, I don't seek drama, right? But if I find myself in the middle of conflict or drama, I try to deal with it, or I try to handle it, or I try to diffuse it, right? So when you're talking about, seeking conflict, or avoiding conflict, I think that's something that's natural for most adults, because there's risk in conflict, right? There's risk in challenge. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. You can't guarantee that it's going to end in your favor, and most of us don't want to take those risks, right? But something else that you were saying that got me thinking is, this narrative of Dr. King has always been one of inspiration, right? One to inspire you, get you to move forward, sort of this movement towards progress, right? So if you think about it, his I Have a Dream speech had all these sort of different components that everybody, basically any group, could get behind, right? And to your point, his writing from the letter from the Birmingham jail and other lesser known things are actually more direct and explicit about what he sees as the problems or challenges, right? I don't know about you or any of you who are listening, in K through 12, we would all learn about Dr. Martin Luther King, but we wouldn't learn about Malcolm X. What we learned about Malcolm X is that, he was anti-white, anti-government. He was something that was opposite of Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King was about nonviolence, right? Like that was the characterization of him. And sort of Malcolm X was more of this sort of militant person. And what I was looking at in that excerpt from the letter was Martin Luther King had some very explicit and direct things that were very strident in their words, that had he orated them, as you said, to an audience, it would have had a different tenor, right? He might have been considered a little bit more closer to Malcolm X than we were led to believe, right? So I think it's interesting that there's sort of this peaceableness about MLK and his legacy that I think sometimes I would say diminishes the full capacity and the full strength of what he was about, that could actually help us in some of these moments, right, in 2020. I feel like if people read Letter from Birmingham Jail, they could see that, to your point, there's a lot of nuance, right? This is all a complicated problem. Like, it's not black and white. It's not easy. It is complicated, and it is wrapped up in history and emotion and what people think about what it means to be an American and all these other things. And so it's important to know that his arguments were complex. He had some really strong things to say to groups of people who, in the I Have a Dream speech, may not have felt like they were the subject of what he was, concerned about. And if those people actually read those letters or some of these other writings, there might have been this sort of, oh, okay. Because most people felt like if they marched on Washington, they had done their duty, right? Like, and once the Civil Rights Bill had been passed, we're all good, right? But I don't know if that's the truth. So I don't know about you, but I feel like I went into this with the question of, is he relevant in 2021? And to people from maybe like our generation, what does he mean? And through this conversation, I've actually come to realize that he is relevant. And he does have some things to say that I think if people were more aware of, that could potentially expand our understanding of who he was, and not just, this shiny inspirational figure on the Lincoln Memorial steps, right?
Absolutely. Like, as I was telling you earlier, like, I think we need to take a holistic view, not just to Martin Luther King, but everything, right? Like, I feel like down to elections, like, so many people are single issue, as I was saying earlier, like voters, like, I'm against abortion, so therefore I'm going to identify as conservative. That there's so many other aspects that goes into each identity, whether you're Republican, Democratic, Independent, Libertarian. There's so much, like, people in general are not monoliths, even down to people who the opposite of me, who aren't liberal and stuff like that. But even then, I don't know if liberal is something I would even describe myself as. And, I'm a fan of Martin Luther King for sure. And like you said, he is relevant today, but it's one of those things where I feel this sense of shame to an extent of like, wow, I just spent a better part of 30, until I started reading the letter, almost 30 years of my life, just playing into what other people were feeding me. And it makes me sad that I didn't observe Malcolm X a bit more, and other back then or throughout history, people doing similar and fighting for the same things that MLK was doing. And now I'm investing more time in those people today, and not all those people are Black, because again, I think that that threat to justice anywhere, or is a threat to justice, or injustice anywhere is threat to justice everywhere, quote, resonates with me so much, because I have so many overlapping, intersectional, interconnected identities, because my insides don't match my outsides, in the sense that I don't know what it's like to be Asian American growing up, other than my own experience. I didn't grow up with Asian parents. I grew up with Mexican American parents. So with that, it's one of those things too, where, I'm trying to again, decenter myself. So today I was trying to read it again and I was being distracted because everything else in the world, where I need to have that grace and patience, not just to the words that I'm reading, but with myself and how I take this in and how I'm going to push them forward. And like you said, reading more about other people who have been doing this work, like Malcolm X. You were telling me about the ballot or the bullet speech, which is something I would, if you want to share more with people about, I'd love for you to tell more people about. So if you could, Maya.
I am not an expert, and to you too, I'm Black. I identify as a Black woman. and a straight Black woman. And I, you know, sometimes feel like I don't know enough either, right? Like I know some about Malcolm X, like I didn't read, you know, his biography or autobiography. I love movies, so sometimes my go-to is the movie versions of people's history. Um, but you know, I think there is, but I do love learning, right? So the Ballot or the Bullet speech that Malcolm X delivered in 1963 or 64. I can't remember explicitly. I have it written down, but my friend introduced that to me last year. And we were having a conversation and she was like, you know, have you ever heard this speech? And I said, no. And I read it. And again, another piece of literature that I felt like could have been written, you know, in 2020, because that's when I read it. But you know, it also gave me a more nuanced understanding of Malcolm X, his ideas. You know, he is not like he's not anti-white or not explicitly anti-government, but his argument were these were systems and actors who were denying rights, privileges, and dignities to people. And so he was against those systems and actors, right? And so those systems and actors happen to be governed and operated by white people. And so he said, if you don't want to be identified or connected to those systems or actors, then you need to stop the activities, right? So it's a deeper and more critical way of thinking about things. He was also talking about government, and he was also talking about Black African American voting blocks, right? Which is the argument that we heard in the 2020 election and in the recent runoff in Georgia, the power of the Black vote that came out in such droves. And now, you know, what are these politicians who they help put in office, what things are they going to do for this particular voting block? But that's a different conversation. But I do think that if you, the world is complicated, it's not easy, there's a lot of nuance. And so the best that we can do as individuals is go out and educate ourselves, learn more, read more, listen more, and then have conversations like this with people that, even though you may have similar thinkings about things, there are going to be places where you differ. And being able to talk about those places where you differ is how we all sort of learn a little bit more and then are able to move forward in different ways than when we entered into the conversation. And ultimately, I think that's the way that change happens, not sort of these, you know, great big light bulbs that go over everybody's head and then, you know, magically the world changes. So I have really enjoyed this conversation with you, Zara. I know you and I know we could talk forever, but I'm not sure the world is ready for that quite yet.
Not yet. It'll keep going. This is one of the many conversations we've already had and we'll have, because like you were saying, like, you know, there's so much more to this and there's so much nuance. And I don't even think I heard about that word until later on in life. And again, like, I think some of the words that from our conversation I'm pulling out is that there's more, like, there's more than just the surface, and that we have to go like deeper with this kind of stuff. But what does deeper mean? And I think what people need to do is define what that means to yourself and know that that definition could change. Like me going deeper into what MLK meant was looking at his other works, not expecting other people to tell me what they are. So like that self-introspective, that self-education. But then it's like also one thing I had to get over as an Asian American queer person, where it's like, it's so easy to fall into this, what about me? What about us? Like, you know, Asia, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, Asian Americans and Asian people in the United States have had this conditional truth put in front of them of, you know, privilege is conditional, about like, you know, we were the cause of COVID-19 because, you know, it originated in China, and like the whole, like, you know, Kung flu and all the horrible racist things that Donald Trump said. And with that, you know, it's not a zero-sum game. Like, that's another reason why I love that quote about injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that we need to work on not just educating ourselves, but decentering our stuff and what we thought we knew. That doesn't mean what we thought we knew wasn't true, such as like the I have a dream speech is very true and very relevant. So I can't like push that education I've had for years aside, but I can put it over here for now and try to make space for other things and try to, you know, hold those multiple truths present and also be comfortable with the unknown and the spectrum of things. Like, especially as a leader, that's something I struggle with. And I know many other people where it's like, I don't know. I didn't know. I feel these kind of negative feelings, but I think we should bask in those differences feelings of what we think we do know. And that's where we make space to be consistent with our actions, to welcome those nuances, to be able to handle them, and to also struggle with them. So that's ultimately what I want to leave the audience or with us today, because that's one of the reasons I enjoy talking to you as much as, like, you know, we have a friendship and a relationship, is that we don't just challenge each other in a way of conflict. We challenge each other in a way of thinking differently, but not just differently for the now, it's the long term. So I just,
I appreciate you too. And I think I would probably say that, you know, the deeper is good, and it's going to be different for everyone, like you said. And the idea that, yes, Dr. King may have been arguing for the rights of Negroes at the time, Blacks, African Americans at the time, but he also is known by a quote that I may butcher a little bit. But the idea that, you know, things that directly affect one person indirectly affects everyone else, right? So the struggles that we as Black Americans have in this country are still struggles that can affect and impact the struggles of other marginalized communities and even economically disadvantaged communities of white people, right? And so I think, you know, part of this is being okay with learning new information. Again, like, not necessarily saying what you learned before was wrong, but that there's always more to learn and more to know. And being uncomfortable is fine. And it's important, I think, to find places where you can work through that discomfort, which is why I love teaching about these things, because I love creating spaces where people can get a whole bunch of new information and that they're, you know, inevitably uncomfortable with in some way, shape, or form, but then offer the space for them to work through it, ask questions, contemplate it, think about it, figure out what it means, and then how they enact with that new knowledge. And so to all of you out there, learn more, go out and find more information. I'm sure we might have some resources in the comment section or the links with this video, but then also find those people in those places where you can be uncomfortable, sit and try to work through that discomfort. Because if we can all be in those places and work through those things individually, then I do think, hopefully, prayerfully, am I going to be alive 60 years from now? Let's say 40 years from now, I hope to still be alive. You know, that we aren't looking back at 2021 having the same types of conversations and struggles that we have now. 40 years from now, may we prayerfully be having made at least some progress.
Yeah, and progress looks different every which way. Like, this conversation may only seem about this big, but really the impact could be even bigger. So I encourage people to look at success differently. And I encourage people to look at learning and, you know, discomfort as a constant thing and comfort as a constant thing, that these, you know, finding those people and places and things that help you work through these things is something that I challenge you to not just be constant and consistent about it, but also have a commitment towards it to look different in many different ways. Like, I will say a part of the way I hold myself accountable in this is talking to people who don't just share my beliefs or look the same as me. I try to go not maybe to the other edge of the water, but where I can, to be challenged on these things, but not in a way of a devil's advocate. To me, that's not good, but challenge in a way where it's like, wow, this isn't like my best friend, or this isn't someone who thinks like me. So I have to give that extra thought and work these extra muscles that I haven't worked as much yet, to be able to articulate and find those ways of talking about this and processing it. Because this is a journey that we're not on just together, but it is very individualized. But I hope those individual things and efforts can lead to a summation similar to what MLK helped bring to us then, and even today, and what we need more than ever going
Yes, I agree.
forward.
Well, thank you for joining. Hopefully you watched till the end of the video.
Yes.
And Zara, thanks so much for the idea and also just for the willingness to jump on and try to do this in short term. And I hope we can do more of these conversations.
Yes, no, let's do more, because talking is part of it, but it's what we do in action. So I know, like, today I may even take another stab at rereading what I already read of the letter of Birmingham jail. And I just thank you, Maya, for, again, going on this with me and welcoming others to come into it, not just calling in, calling out, and calling through all this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and see you later.
Yes, till next time.